Welcome to the 7th episode of the 10 Lost Tribes in Jewish Consciousness series here on Svarim Chatter. And I'm Nachi Weinstein. In this episode of the series, we move on to the early modern period and explore the tribes in Jewish consciousness in Europe during the 15th and 16th centuries. We discuss the role of messianism in the 10 Lost Tribes discourse, the role of Prester John, who was discussed in last week's episode, but we discuss it here as it relates specifically to the 10 Lost Tribes in Jewish consciousness. We also follow up and mention Red Jews, the story of Akdamus. We talk about David Reuveni, who will be the focus of next week's episode of the series, and much more. We also talk about Shlomo Molcho, who is relevant to David Reuveni, and for that there was an earlier episode with Dr. Benmelech, who's the author of a terrific book on Shlomo Molcho in Hebrew. So I would reference, and I'll link to that episode in the show's notes for those that want to listen to it. The corporate sponsor of this series, as always, is Gluck Plumbing. For all your service needs, big or small, in New Jersey, with a full service division from boiler replacements, main sewer line snakeouts, camera main lines to a simple faucet leak, Gluck Plumbing Service Division has you covered. Give them a call, 732-523-1836, extension 1. And if you call, please tell them you heard it on the podcast and thank them for their continued support of Svarim Chatter. This specific episode of the series is sponsored by Mosaica Press. Check out their many titles at mosaicapress.com, including the best-selling book, Reclaiming Dignity, with hashkafic and halachic explorations that untangle the threads of mitzvah, midah, halacha, and cultural practice. Reclaiming Dignity highlights the universal relevance of tznius for both men and women, evoking a sense of empowerment and pride in this significant Jewish value. This best-selling book by Mrs. Bracha Polyakov and Rabbi Anthony Manning contains a diverse anthology of 26 essays by leading educators and influencers and a comprehensive source-based section explaining the halachas. Get your copy now at mosaicapress.com and use the code CHATTER, CHATTER, for an exclusive 15% off. And I will say that all Mosaica Press titles use code CHATTER, CHATTER, for 15% off, and there'll be a link in the show's notes. To sponsor an individual episode of this series or an episode on the podcast, please email me, svarimchatter@gmail.com, and see the links in the show's notes. Please, you can subscribe to the new Svarim Chatter Substack, which is like a blog that gets emailed to you for those that aren't familiar. The information is in the show's notes. It is free. There's also a paid option there if you wish to support the podcast in that way, and there will be some bonus content for paying subscribers. You can also join the Svarim Chatter WhatsApp community, which is the admin-only chat where new information on books and Svarim and other things are posted, and there's also a chat dedicated to discussing the podcast and podcast-related topics. Please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on your favorite podcast listening platform, especially if you use Apple. If you can rate and review it there, very much appreciated. And as always, any questions, comments, feedback, appreciated, either via WhatsApp, email, information in the show's notes, and very much appreciate it, and enjoy the 7th episode of the series. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined once again by Dr. Moti Benmelech, who is Senior Lecturer in the History Department of Herzog College in Eilat Shvut. And we will be discussing the 10 Lost Tribes and in the early modern period, so the 15th and 16th century, and kind of Jews' perception of them, the lost tribes, kind of the lost tribes in Jewish consciousness at the time period. And again, as with the early, this is another episode in the ongoing series on the lost tribes. But again, we're not looking for the lost tribes here in this series. This is something we're more dealing with, again, the Jews' consciousness and the Jews in Jews' consciousness and the Jews, the Jews' perception of them. Yeah. So thank you, Dr. Benmelech, for joining me again.
And I think that the story of the lost tribes is an interesting story because it enables you to get into the head or the back of the head of early modern Jews or whatever other period, and see how they saw themselves, how they saw the Jewish world, and through this mirror of the lost tribes, the interest in the lost tribes, and the search for the lost tribes.
Okay. So I want to ask you. So let's start like this. On a previous episode, we discussed Eldad Hadani, and Eldad shows up in 884, right? He's in 9th century. And that's the first interest in the lost tribes in a long time. Mm-hmm. Suddenly now, fast forward, we're talking early modern period, so 15th, 16th century, and another 600-700 years pass.
and they kind of fade out, right? They're kind of not there. If it's inaccurate, correct me. They're not really so much there, and then suddenly, here we go all again.
Yeah, but maybe I'll refer here to one other reference to the lost tribes before the 16th century, between Eldad Adani and the big interest in them in the 15th and 16th century, and that is in a famous letter written by Yoshua Lorki. Yoshua Lorki was a Spanish Jew. He was a student of his rabbi Shlomo Levi, the rabbi of the city of Burgos, converted to Christianity in late 14th century. He did not become what people commonly call anus. He was a convert, and he was a believer, and eventually became the bishop of Burgos of that city. And when he converted, his student Yoshua Lorki wrote him a letter, sort of a public letter, in which he said, I know you were my rabbi, you were my teacher. I appreciate you. I want to understand, why did you convert? And they raise it, and they suggest various reasons why his rabbi might have converted. And of course, he denies each of those reasons and proves that he shouldn't have converted because of that. And one of the reasons that he mentions is, maybe you came to the conclusion that God left the people of Israel. God left Am Israel because you look at the current situation of the Jews, and you see that the European Jews were already expelled from England. Jews were expelled from many territories in France and in Germany. So basically, the situation, the lives of the Jews in Europe are not as good as they were, and it seems that things are getting worse. So basically, maybe you got the notion that God left Am Israel, left the people of Israel, and his proof that this is wrong is that the lost tribes are alive. And he says to him, basically, we are only less than 20% of the people of Israel. The big majority of the people of Israel, of Am Israel, the 10 lost tribes, they live somewhere and they are free and nobody rules them, as everybody knows. So basically, the fact that European Jews are not in the best condition, the fact that European Jews are under Christian pressure and are subordinated to the Christians, does not prove anything, because it is only a small minority of the Jews, and most of the Jews are in great conditions and they are independent, and nobody forces them to do anything. But again, Yoshua Lorki writes that, and the next thing that he does is not to go and look and search for the lost tribes. Again, his reference to the lost tribes is only to answer a specific problem that he had. The 14th and 15th century are a period of an increase in the Jewish-Christian debate. So he uses the lost tribes as an argument in this debate, but no more than that. He's not interested in them in any way other than that. So basically, when we find someone that refers to the lost tribes, it is always in order to solve a problem that he has as a Jew, not because he is trying to look and find and to solve the problems of the lost tribes of Israel. Now, when we move to the 15th and 16th century, here we can find a significant shift, because we have from 1402 to 1530, for a period of like 130 years, we have dozens of letters. I counted more than 30 letters, that refer, not including letters that refer to messianism and things like that, only letters that refer to the lost tribes of Israel. And in those letters, the attitude is different, the atmosphere is different. And basically, the notion is that the lost tribes are coming back. And in those letters, you can find rumors about that River Sambation stopped roaming, and the tribes crossed it, and the tribes, and another shift that happens in this period is that the tribes that, in the letter of in the writings from the meeting with Eldad Adani, basically the main character of the tribes is that they are very pious. There aren't any chayot meot, or there aren't any snakes or scorpions or dangerous animals in the land of the lost tribes, and they have a halachic thread, which is they don't have any machloket. They have a pure halachic thread that goes all the way to Moshe Rabbeinu. And in the 15th and 16th century, they become warriors. I mean, Eldad does say that they are also strong warriors, but when you read the writings that come from the Micha Perry calls the Eldad literature, the main character of the tribes is their Jewish righteousness, that they are pious, that they are tzaddikim and everything. When you read the sources from the 15th and 16th century, the main character of the tribes is that of warriors. And what the Jews are interested in is their military power. And there are letters saying that, the Pope or the Sultan, or even the king of the Portuguese king, he heard and he knows that the tribes are coming, and he now regrets that he expelled the Jews because he figures out that is going to cause him troubles. So basically, the atmosphere, the language is a political one. The people mentioned in those letters are the Pope, kings, I don't know, some important noblemen from various places in Europe, and the notion is that something is happening in the political field, and from here on, the world will have to consider the tribes as a political and military power. And they are going to conquer Israel, and eventually this will, of course, affect for the good the Jews, the European Jews. Now, those are Jewish sources, letters sent. Most of them are being sent between Eretz Israel and Italy. But in the 1520s, we have pamphlets printed in Germany that mention. And when we talk about pamphlets at this period, pamphlets are the I might say the prefiguration of newspapers. Those were booklets that were printed on a very cheap paper in big quantities and were extremely popular. They contained all kinds of news, all kinds of interesting stories. They were there were not pictures, but drawings that showed what's here. And we have at least 2 German pamphlets from the 1520s that bring news about the lost tribes, that they already crossed the Sambatyon. They are 30 days in a distance of 30 days walk or horse ride from the land of Israel, and they plan to conquer it from the south. So it is not only a Jewish story, it is a European story, an international story. Now, so basically that's the big shift, in my opinion, between the image of the lost tribes before the 15th and 16th century and the image in this period. And I repeat about those 2 points that I think they are important. First, they become warriors and a political power, and the story is no more only a Jewish story, it is a European story. And basically, when you read those letters, you get the notion that the kings, the Pope, local rulers, they all have to consider the lost tribes now on. Now, so those are the main differences. Now, one more thing about letters. Letters, especially letters in Hebrew in this period, are not a private thing. I mean, it's not an email that you read and you move it to the trash or whatever. And those letters are being read publicly. And in many of those letters, you find references to not to specific people, but to a wider audience. And sometimes the authors of those letters say, let everyone know that this and this happened. Another thing is that in many of these letters, we find references to other letters. For example, we have a letter of the famous Rabbi Ovadia Mibartenura, wrote the famous commentary on the Mishnah, a letter to his brother, and his brother asked him about all kind of unique things that happened in Kever Shmuel Hanavi near Jerusalem. Things which are, of course, out of the normal order, and there are maybe signs that tell the redemption or whatever. And we have a letter from a few years earlier, which was sent from Jerusalem to Italy, in which the writer tells about those things that happen in Shmuel Hanavi grave in near Jerusalem. So and again, this letter was not sent to the brother of Rabbi Ovadia Mibartenura. It was not even sent to Bartenura, to his city. It was sent to someone else. But the rumors that were spread in these letters spread throughout the Jewish communities in Italy, and therefore those letters you have to treat them like pamphlets or like newspapers or like news. They had a very big public audience, and they had a great amount of influence about the Jews, on the Jews.
Yeah, so I want to, first of all, I mentioned, way back when I asked you, I mentioned that, there was nothing in those couple hundred years. Yes, as you said, there was. And also, I should mention Binyamin of Tudela, famous traveler. In his travels, he talks about those. So they were there. I guess the fact that they come so to the forefront, like here with all these letters, as you mentioned, some 30-something letters, just in the Jewish letters alone. So, but we'll get to the transformation. I think it's very interesting that they transform, and that's a big part of the story here. But why this like intense interest in this? Like you're saying, this is an amazing amount of letters that we have, for sure, more even that we don't have. Do we know why is there this sudden massive rise? Even as you say, there was some interest before.
Yeah. I think that's the big question, and I think that I can at least try and give it an answer. And my answer is based on the first letter. The first letter that we have that mentions the rumors about the lost tribes, and this is a letter which was sent from Venice to Ferrara, not a nearby city in Italy with a big Jewish community, and it was sent in 1402. And the letter says a delegation arrived here in Venice from the land of Prester John. And members of this delegation tell us that the lost tribes are doing that way or the other way. And when we check the archives in Venice, we find reference. We find that there was that there actually was such a delegation that arrived at this time. So basically, what happens here is that a delegation, and we'll talk in a minute, I assume, about who is Prester John and why he is so significant to our story. But basically what happens is that something happens in the Christian world. A delegation arrives in Venice. They are Christians. They are interested in Italy from a religious Christian perspective, and the Jews interpret this arrival or transfer it to their own world of the lost tribes. And the connecting ring here, or the connecting point here is Prester John. So maybe I'll say a few words about Prester John, or
yeah, I think you should. Yeah.
Okay. So Prester John basically is let's start. The story of Prester John is a legend that circles in the Christian world. We have the first written reference to this legend in late 12th century, 1184, something like that. German writer mentions a rumor that he heard from a bishop from Lebanon. And basically, the story of Prester John is a mirror picture of the story of the lost tribes. So if the story of the lost tribes is that somewhere in the world, when medieval Europeans talk about somewhere far away, very far away, it is always in the east. So somewhere in the east, and what's synonym with east in medieval Europe is India. India is not the country that we call today India. This is part of India, but in India refers to everything which is to the east. So India is India. India is the eastern republics of what used to be the Soviet Union. All those stands. India can be Africa. So basically, the story of Prester John is that somewhere in the east there is a Christian kingdom which is very rich, very powerful, and very pious. And all those things that we read about the lost tribes, that there aren't any harmful animals there, and snakes and stuff. All this appears also in the stories of Prester John. And there is even a suggestion that maybe the story of Prester John was actually influenced by the story of the lost tribes, because in a way the lost tribes pose a big challenge to the Christian world, because the Christian notion is that we are right because God left the people of Israel and choose us instead, and the proof to that is the current situation of the Jews. So if there is somewhere a Jewish kingdom, an independent and prosperous Jewish kingdom, that's a theological problem from a Christian point of view. So let's go back to the story of Prester John. So again, Prester John is somewhere in the east. He's very rich, he's very pious, and very, very important, the king is also the priest. The king of this land is Prester John. Unlike the situation in Europe, in which the king or the emperor and the pope are rivals, and this rivalry influences many other fields of life. In the land of Prester John, the king is also the priest, and there is this unity of state and religion, and everything works well. And they are very rich, and they are very strong, and everything. The only point is that you have to go. They live in an isolated place. It is very complicated to gather. It's a long journey, and from the 13th century, as letters that were written supposedly by Prester John circulated in Europe, these letters mentioned that the 10 lost tribes live just by the land of Prester John. And the most important thing is that they pay tribute to Prester John. So basically, the 10 lost tribes of Israel are also subjected to a Christian king. There isn't any Jew who is independent. Those Jews, from a Jewish point of view, are independent. They are also subjected to the perfect Christian king, Prester John. Now, when a Jew reads this letter, he can decide if he believes that the 10 tribes are subjected to Prester John or not. But the interesting thing is that it gives him a location. You want to get to the 10 lost tribes? It is possible now. Go to the land of Prester John, and when you get there, you'll find nearby the lost tribes of Israel. The problem, of course, is where is Prester John? After the Crusades, after the Crusaders were expelled from the land of Israel and it was reconquered by the Muslims, the Christian world, the European Christian world, got the notion or understood that the Muslims are a threat, they are a political power, and they are what stands between European Christians and the land of Israel. and Jerusalem, and the holy places to Christianity in the land of Israel and in Jerusalem. So basically, it would have been great to solve all our problems if we can contact another Christian power who is closer to the land of Israel, and maybe go on a new crusade. That time, not of crusaders who are coming all the way from Europe and land in ships in the land of Israel, and they are cut away from supplies and from everything else, but with the help of some sort of a Christian power, of a local Christian power, of an Eastern Christian power. And from that period on, we see people start searching for Prester John. And they search for him in various places, and again, when in the 13th century, when the Mongols invade Europe, the notion is that let's call Prester John, let's get in touch with Prester John and fight the Mongols. So whenever something or someone threats Christian Europe, they are trying to search for Prester John. So basically, those searches for Prester John are also, when you put the Jewish from a Jewish point of view, they might lead us to the land of the lost tribes. Now, most of those searches for Prester John were by delegations of very few people. Most of they were sent by the Pope, and such delegation that contained a few monks and a few other Christian officials tried to go to Central Asia and look there for the land of Prester John, and to other places. But basically, they never came back with a real result. This changed from the late 14th century, early 15th century, when rumors spread in Europe about a Christian kingdom in Africa, an independent Christian kingdom in Africa, and that is the kingdom of Ethiopia. And the Christian ruler of this kingdom, he calls himself an emperor. And Europeans, when they heard about this, when they figured that this is what's happening, that they did 1 + 1, that must be Prester John. The interesting thing is that it was sort of a discourse of people who can't hear each other, so of the deaf. When the Ethiopians heard about European Christians, they became interested in European Christians for their own purposes, which were obtaining relics, learning more about Christianity, about European Christianity. And since Ethiopia is also an isolated Christian island in a Muslim world, so they also considered Europe as a source of support that could help them against their Muslim rivals over there. Eventually, from late 14th century, European cartographers in maps that they draw, they named the area of Ethiopia as the land of Prester John. And from early 15th century, delegations from Ethiopia started to arrive in Europe. And those delegations, they saw themselves as Ethiopians, but their hosts, when they arrive in Venice, in the Venetian papers, they are treated as a delegation from Prester John, and we have references to the gifts that they brought with them, and so forth. So basically, in early 14th century, more and more, it's not that many, but there are every few years another delegation come, and rumors spread about Ethiopia. So the notion is that we are close to Prester John. We are close to the land of Prester John. We are getting in touch with Prester John. And of course, in Jewish eyes or in Jewish perception, the notion is that we are now close to the 10 lost tribes. And since the European search for Prester John was a search for a political and military ally who could help, who might help us in the future, in a future battle against them, in a future crusade. So did the Jews saw the lost tribes of Israel as being primarily a military and political power that, and of course, if they will get, if they will start doing what they can do, the eventual outcome of that will be the redemption of Israel and the reestablishing of it sounds weird, but some sort of a Jewish state in the land of Israel. It sounds too Zionist, but basically this is the notion. They have this army, they're on their way to Jerusalem, we'll join them, and end of the story.
And that's going to culminate in the Reuveni Molcho, as our previous episode, Shlomo Molcho, your book on Molcho. But so here, interestingly, is this kind of a messianic discourse? Is this messianism here, or this is just an interest in the lost tribes and Prester John? Everyone in Europe is suddenly interested in Prester John, and then because of that, as you're saying, that spills over to the lost tribes and the Jewish angle.
I'll answer you with an interesting source. That is in 1474, something like that, in Mantova, a North Italian town with a big Jewish community, not big, but with a strong Jewish community, and with a press, the press of Avraham Konat. It's not very clear if it was the first book or the second book, but one of the first books that were published there was a book entitled Sipur Eldad Adani, the story of Eldad Adani. It was the first time in which sources about Eldad Adani, the letter that was sent from Kairouan to the Gaon, mentioning Eldad Adani, and some other sources that mention him, were printed in Hebrew. I mean, in any language, but they were printed in Hebrew. And you have to remember, this is like the first wave of Hebrew books being printed. The earliest Hebrew book, printed Hebrew book that we have is from 1470, something like that. And one of the first, I don't know if it was how many books were printed before him, but it is among the first 20 or 30 or 40 books which were printed in Hebrew. One of them was a book about Eldad Adani. And most of the books that were printed back then, in the early stages of the print, were Rashi, Perush Rashi al Torah, some Masechtot of the Shas, maybe prayer books, Sidurim, classic Jewish books that have a large audience, because eventually, printing is a business. And he prints the story of Eldad Adani. So in his opinion, this is something that is going to catch. People are going to pay money for that. And more than that, in the first, the publisher writes in the first lines of the book, he writes the following rhymes, and just let me find the exact quote. So Avraham Konat, the owner of the press in Mantova, wrote the following rhymes in the opening paragraph of the book, and he wrote, "In your name, God, my purchaser, I will put all my certainty and lay all my purposes to Eldad Adani." So basically, he is alluding here for some sort of a messianic belief. Right? He puts everything, and he's explicitly saying, I'm publishing this because I think that this has a meaning. It's not only it is not only a business. It is something which is more than that. And it is very clear when you read those letters that the notion is not. This is not just a political thing. This is a messianic story. And we know that the first third of the 16th century was a period of messianic arousal. We know that people like Yitzhak Abarbanel is writing about messianism, and Rabbi Yosef ibn Shraga, and Avraham. There are various people. Most of them are unknown to the average listener, but this was a period of great interest and of great messianic expectations. The clearest example for that, which I don't know if I can connect it to the belief in the lost tribes, but again, it happens at this period, is the messianic movement around a guy whose name was Asher Lemlein. And this is a messianic movement that spread from Frankfurt to Regensburg, which is, it covered almost all of the Ashkenazi world. And we know about people who, David Gantz, the famous writer from Prague, wrote that his grandfather broke down the oven for baking matzot in Prague, saying that, we won't need it next year because next year we will be sitting in Jerusalem. So it is, and again, I can't connect, I can't point a direct connection between Asher Lemlein and the story of the lost tribes, but this is something which is in the air. And Asher Lemlein says that the Messiah will come in 1502, and Yitzhak Abarbanel said that he will come in 1503, and Yosef ibn Shraga said that he will come in 1512, and Avraham Halevi, who is the Spanish Kabbalist who sits in Jerusalem and corresponds with many Ashkenazi families in Spain, he builds a whole messianic process that will start in 1524 and will end in 1540, and the various stages of this messianic process correlate with the rumors about the lost tribe. In 1524, an Ashkenazi guy from Italy writes to Avraham Halevi, and he asks him, okay, you said that something will happen you said that the first stage will happen this year. Nothing happened. How do you explain this? So he told him, yeah, that's because the first stage happens in the land of the lost tribes. So basically, you still didn't hear about it. And if you want to go farther with this, 1524 is the year when David Reuveni appears, and David Reuveni's writings are full with references to the messianic ideas spread by Avraham Halevi. So it is clear that David Reuveni was aware of these calculations. More than that, when David Reuveni appeared in Italy, at first he appeared in Venice in 1524, and he later moved to Rome. When we check the people that helped him, that supported him, that he stayed in their houses, almost all of them are people who were that way or the other connected to this messianic correspondent about the lost tribes. So again, people who were involved in this correspondence, people who read those letters, they didn't see this just as, an interesting rumor. They saw this as something which is real, and therefore, when a guy appears and he's telling everybody that he is from the land of the lost tribes, those who come to his help are those who were already aware, are those who are already part of this correspondent of this messianic correspondent. Tragically, I think that the tragic fate of David Reuveni and of Shlomo Molcho was also one of the reasons for the decline in interest in the lost tribes, because David Reuveni, when he arrives, he introduces himself as an ambassador from the land of the lost tribes, and he goes to Rome and he talks to the Pope, and the Pope gives him a letter of recommendation to the King of Portugal, and he goes to Portugal, and everywhere he is accepted as a legitimate ambassador of a Jewish state. And that doesn't mean that everybody believed him, but that means that nobody could deny it. So they figured out that, okay, let's give him a chance. Let's listen to him. Eventually, and here two things happened. David Reuveni went to Portugal and was there for a few months. And we have to remember that Portugal is a place where there aren't any Jews anymore. The Jews, they were not expelled from Portugal, they were forced to baptize. But there aren't any observing Jews in Portugal, and he's the exception. And he raises a lot of interest and a lot of enthusiasm, and maybe even a lot of sort of messianic expectations around him in Portugal. And he sits there in the court and he negotiates with the king and he tries to get something from him. And eventually he's being deported from Portugal, and the king doesn't want to have any business with him. And this is, of course, connected to the Molcho story. We won't get to it now. And 2 years later, he appears back in Italy, again in the same city that we mentioned before, in the city of Mantova. And again, he introduces himself as an ambassador from a free Jewish state. And there they found out that he's cheating, because he's asking people to help him to fabricate documents, because he claims that he lost his documents and in all his journeys and so forth. And that's like the first crack in the belief. It's not the first crack in the belief. Nobody really believed him even before that, but that's like the proof that something is wrong. If until now people didn't know how to to believe it, didn't know if they believe him, how much they can believe him. This was the proof that he's not who he's claiming to be. And Jews of Mantova told the Marquis, the local lord, they told him that he's trying to fabricate documents and so forth. So this was the first crack in his image. Eventually, and again, we are entering into the story of Molcho, and I don't want to do this. You can listen to the other podcast about Molcho. But eventually, he joined Molcho, and they went together to meet Emperor Charles V in Regensburg. They both were arrested there. Molcho was executed, and he was taken to Spain and imprisoned there. And the tragic thing here is that this guy, that until few months earlier, he was still introducing himself as a general of the Jewish army in the land of the Lost Tribes, and an ambassador, and he was sent by his brother, who is the king of the Lost Tribes, and etc., etc. And there is all this army of the Lost Tribes that stands behind him, and he's trying to do business with the European Christians, to collaborate with them, and he's now sent to prison. And nothing happens. No army arrives. No king is searching for his brother. Nothing. I think that this was like the final nail in the coffin of the belief in the existence of a Jewish powerful state, which might do something that will affect Europe. And I would like to mention in this context a very famous story. This is the story of the Akdamot. If you're familiar with this story, this is a story about how the piyut Akdamot was written. Akdamot is a piyut which is said by the Ashkenazim at the beginning of Kriyat Torah in Shavuot, in the first day of Shavuot. And the legend goes that we know that this piyut was composed by Rabbi Meir Schatz, who is an Ashkenazi scholar from the generation before Rashi, the 11th century. And the legend goes that some Ashkenazi kingdom was threatened by a mean Christian magician, and nobody could stop this magician. And eventually this magician was killing Jews daily just for and nobody can stop him, because he has those magical powers, and he's telling the Jews, okay, for 1 year I won't harm you, and during this year you should go and find someone who can fight with me. who can how should I go? Who can stand against me and maybe even beat me? And of course, this someone must be someone who is whose powers are magical powers. And he tells them, I give you a year to find someone who can stand against me, and when you will find this guy, we will have a sort of a duel. And if I will win, if he will win, he will kill me. If I will win, I will kill all the Jews. And they don't find anyone, and eventually they hear that among the lost tribes you can find someone who can stand against him, and they send Rabbi Meir Schatz to bring him. Now Rabbi Meir Schatz goes all the way to the land of the lost tribes, but he can't cross the river Sambatyon because the river roams throughout the Yemei Yachol, the days of the week, the 6 days of the week. When it stops roaming and you can cross this river, it is already Shabbat, and you can't cross the river on the Shabbat. And he decides to cross the river on the Shabbat. And when he is captured by the Jews on the other side of the Sambatyon, he tells them, look, it's Pikuach Nefesh. It's if I won't cross it on Shabbat, he will kill all the Jews in my community. And they understand it, and they send one of them, a magician from the land of the lost tribes, to fight against this Christian magician. And he also crosses the river Sambatyon on Shabbat. But Rabbi Meir can't cross because crossing the river is allowed only because it is Pikuach Nefesh, right? Going back home is not part of the Pikuach Nefesh. So basically, Rabbi Meir remains in the land of the lost tribes, and the messenger from the land of the lost tribes won't be able to come back home because he will be staying with his community in Germany, in Ashkenaz. And eventually, so Rabbi Meir Schatz gave this guy, he gave him the piyut that he wrote, the Akdamot, in order that he will be remembered in his own homeland, in his own home city, by saying this piyut there. And eventually he arrives in the city, and there is this duel between him and the Christian magician, and he wins, and the Jews are saved, and everything is good. But the interesting thing about this story is that the 10 lost tribes are still those who can save the Jews in this story. But there are two other important points. The first of them is that they don't have a military power. It is not that the army of the lost tribes is going to help the Jews. They have some sort of spiritual, magical power that can help them. So we go back to the image of the lost tribes as holding some sort of a spiritual quality that is above the regular spiritual quality of the Jews, of other Jews. The second and most important point in this story is that when you cross the river Sambatyon, you will never come back. So basically, it is impossible to create an ongoing contact with the Jews of the lost tribes. If a Jew crosses the Sambatyon, he can never come back. So basically, the lost tribes, the image of the lost tribes from this story is again an image of people who are disconnected, absolutely disconnected from the rest of the people of Israel. There is no way to get in touch with them. Getting in touch with the lost tribes means that you will never come back to your home, means disconnecting with your family, with your community, with your hometown. And in my opinion, this story reflects the shift in the image of the lost tribes from the 1530s or 1540s on, after the failure of David Reuveni. I'll mention one last point in this context, and that is that those are the years in which Europe understands what Ethiopia is really about, and they figure out that the Ethiopians themselves don't have too much power. Portuguese monk who visited Portugal described the emperor, the Portuguese who visited Ethiopia described the Ethiopian emperor as the young guy whose beard didn't grow up yet, who lives in a tent rather than a big palace or something like that, and who is basically powerless. So again, there is a parallel between the way Jews see the way the European Jews see and understand the lost tribes, and the way that Europeans or the way Christian Europe sees the land of Prester John. And when the European, both communities, the Jewish community and the Christian community, lost their belief in the help of this, Eastern magical community at about the same period, and out of the same reasons.
So just something here to follow up on, and this is something that you mentioned a while back, is that this transformation into warriors, and this has to do also with like the Red Jews. This is something that which I will mention for listeners already. You mentioned Lemline. There'll be a separate episode that I have with Rebecca Voss about this in this series. But where does this kind of come from? That kind of transformation that you've been discussing, that they kind of suddenly change.
So the transformation. I'll start with first saying that this martial image, the image of the lost tribes as warriors, does exist in the story of Eldad of Eldad Adani. He refers to this, but people, it did not shape the image of those Jews until the 15th century. They were seen more as holding some sort of spiritual quality, religious quality, rather than martial quality. I think that the shift is connected, on the one hand, to the story of the Red Jews, and the story of the Red Jews. And I assume that you will hear about this in the conversation with Rebecca Voss. But the story of the Red Jews is basically a German story. It is a story that appears in German from the 13th century or something like that. And we have to remember that Northern Italian Jewry in the 15th and 16th century is essentially an Ashkenazi Jewry. The famous Yiddish linguist Eric Hatim suggested that to call Italy Ashkenaz 3, as the first Ashkenaz is Germany, the second Ashkenaz 2 is Poland, and the third Ashkenaz is northern Italy. And because since the middle of the 14th century on, there is an ongoing immigration of Jews who were either expelled or left the German and French territories due to the change in the attitude and in the situation of the Jews in those lands. And those Jews immigrate to one of the two places, either to Poland or to northern Italy. And when we look about the rabbis in the Jewish communities of northern Italy, we find names like Katzenelbogen, Katz, and so forth. The name Sarfati is a very common name in Jewish Italy. We know about Rabbi Moshe Bazola, which means that he came from the city of Basel. So the population there is an Ashkenazi population, and they bring with them this image of the Red Jews, or the Reute Juden, this German image of the lost tribes as a powerful, savage, unstoppable warriors, as a nation that holds a very strong army. And I assume that the connection between this German tradition brought from Germany by the Jews and the European search for Prester John, which is also a search for a political and military power, those things together created or strengthened or focused on the military power as the main character of the Lost Tribes of Israel.
Okay, so we kind of touched on a lot here, but there's one thing that we didn't, I do want to make sure we do get to, is that you mentioned Eldad Adani a bunch, and Eldad it shows up in the 9th century. Listeners again are familiar. You mentioned Micha Perry in his episode, but the reaction to Eldad, and then the reaction to the tribes here, especially you mentioned Reuveni. Reuveni shows up, and the response kind of to him, and then overall to the tribes. What are the similarities and what are the differences between the reaction to Eldad and the reaction to Reuveni and just in general the Lost Tribes in the 15th, 16th century?
I think that there are more similarities than differences because I think that in both cases, those either Eldad or David Reuveni, they held a challenge for the Jewish for the Jews, because basically, the Jews, whether it is in 9th century Kaiwan, Northern Africa, or 16th century Italy, the Jews are very comfortable with the situation as it is. I mean, they managed to settle sorts of a status quo, or however you call it, with the Christian world or with the Muslim world, if you talk about Kaiwan, and their instinct is to keep this situation, and the appearance of someone who can change the whole thing is very problematic. I think that it is, and on the one hand, you can't ignore him. You can't say that he's a liar, or the 10 Lost Tribes don't really exist. They do exist. We have enough sources. We have enough traditions about the Jews. We have this hope. We say 3 times a day that we hope for the kibbutz galuyot, for reuniting with the Lost Tribes. So you can't just ignore it. You can't just say it is impossible. But on the other hand, you don't really want this to happen. So there is a big amount of disbelief from both Jewish communities in the 9th century Kaiwan and the 16th century in Italy in those messengers. And for example, when Eldad arrives in the letter that the Jews of Kaiwan send to the Gaon in Baghdad, they tell him, he speaks in this weird language. He has those weird words that we don't understand, and he said that they called the bird that way, and they called other things different names, and we tested him. I mean, he told us, and we wrote him down. And after a few days, we returned to him and asked him, "How did you say that in your language you say a bird or whatever it is?" So basically, what we see from this is that they don't believe him. They test him. They try to prove that, maybe to see if he's cheating. The same things happens with David Reuveni when he arrives in Rome and he introduces himself as a very pious Jew, and he's fasting 6 days a week, and he's just praying all the time, and he doesn't want to meet people. So there is this guy. His name is Yehuda de Blanish, and he's telling that he was appointed as a sort of a guard to see if he is really not eating, to see if he's really fasting, if he's really praying all the time, or maybe he's hiding something in his bag, and when nobody looks, he eats. So basically, the attitude was in both cases of disbelief, and on the other end it's what we call in Hebrew kabdeu v'chashdeu. I mean, you say that you are from the Lost Tribes. Okay, we can't deny it, so we'll treat you as if you are from the Lost Tribes, but that doesn't mean that we really believe that you are what you claim. And I think that the clearest point is that when Jews find out that he's trying to forge documents, they go and tell this to the authorities. They go and tell this to the ruler of the city. So basically, when they have to choose between two sides, the local political leader, whom that they know that is responsible for their comfort life here, or this guy who is telling all kind of these weird stories about himself, they will choose the Christian head of the state rather than this weird Jewish guy who arrived from nowhere, basically.
And as you mentioned, Molcho, Reuveni, Molcho, and then the Molcho being killed and Reuveni being killed, that kind of leads to that's kind of the downfall where we see it kind of recede somewhat in the Jewish consciousness, right? That's how you see it after post.
Yeah, definitely. Let me just mention one interesting thing. That is Rabbi Azriel Deayena, who was the rabbi of Sabioneta of another Jewish community in Italy, and he's saying something very interesting. In his responsa, he was asked about Shlomo Molcho, and in a different context. Molcho was wearing what was dressed not according to the Jewish customs back then. He was he dressed up in fancy clothes which were not common among the Jews, or which Jews preferred not to wear. So Rabbi Yisrael Dayana was asked, how should we treat him? And he wrote, he was absolutely in favor of Molcho, and he says, he meets the Pope and he meets important people, so he has to dress up that way. He's absolutely right. Give him all the help and support that you can. But in a different place, he refers to David Reuveni, and he refers to him as a liar, as a forger. So basically, you could be a supporter of Molcho and against David Reuveni. But the way I see it, the failure of David Reuveni and Molcho was a blow, a strong blow to both the messianic expectations of this period and also to the belief in the actual existence of the lost tribes, not as not as something which is beyond reach, but as in the belief in the possibility to get in touch with the lost tribes.
Yeah, you mentioned Rav Shil Diana. His tshuvas were printed in 2 volumes, I think, by Tel Aviv University Press years ago. Not in print for a long time. Books about with his rest of all his other Italian stuff. Actually, a friend of mine, Avi Diana, listens to the podcast. He traced himself back. Diana's around to trace himself back to Rav Shil Diana today. So, I mean, okay, I guess that's really one other thing really to mention here that we didn't. You mentioned these letters. So do we know who wrote these letters, where they wrote them to? And is there anywhere that if listeners are interested in seeing these letters, can they be seen anywhere?
Well, those letters, you can find those letters. You can find them in a few, I think that almost all of them were published. You can find them either in the collection of letters published by Avraham Ya'ari, Igrot Eretz Israel. So you can find there some of those letters. I think that this is the best place to look for them, because I think that he holds there most of the letters, even if he didn't manage to identify all the writers of those letters or the exact dates in which they were written. But most of the letters appears there. Other letters were discussed by Avraham David in his articles, in various articles, or by various other researchers. I myself published 2 of those letters. But I think that the interesting thing is not the letters themselves, but reading them as part of a corpus, reading them as part of a body of letters that can tell us about the concept about how Jews saw and how Jews understood the lost tribes of Israel. And again, Ya'ari is the obvious place to start this reading.
Okay, now I wanted to add, that's the last thing I wanted to ask you, was about other suggested reading you have on this topic. I know you have English and Hebrew articles on this and other books. I'll mention first. I'll just mention before I leave you with the question. I'll mention that I'll link here, even though our previous episode with Molcho, for those interested, and your Molcho book, which is only in Hebrew, and I will link as well. But what other suggested reading would you recommend for listeners who are interested in reading more about this?
Okay, so other reading that I can suggest is again, I apologize for doing this, but I will refer to a paper two papers that I published, one of them about David Reuveni specifically, and the other one is about those letters. This paper was published in Hebrew, and it also has an English version. There is a book, an interesting book about the Red Jews, written by, he's red-haired. He has a red hair, so he's also considered as the Red Jew. I forgot the name, but it is called The Red Jews. And of course, Rebecca Foss is working right now on a book about the Red Jews, and she also has a paper about the Red Jews, which was published in the AJS Review. And of course, there is the book by Tzvi Benit about the lost tribes. Andrew Gow, that's his name. Andrew Gow. He wrote the book about the Red Jews. Rebecca wrote about it. I wrote a little bit about it. Basically, this is, in my opinion, like the basic things that I can think about. And again, maybe I will send you links to a few other papers that refer to specific letters. But again, I think that the notion here is to read those papers as part of something bigger, not as specific letters that deal with very specific things themselves.
Yeah, I'll mention just one thing on Rebecca Voss. Her first book, Disputed Messiahs, which talks about Lemline and Molcho and Reuveni, talks about Red Jews, and then she has a new book coming on the Red Jews as well. So
on the Red Jews.
Yeah,
the first book was published in German. That's why I didn't recommend it here, because I assume that most of the listeners.
But now it's in English. It's been translated to English.
The book, right. The book about the Red Jews is in English. Will be published in English.
No, but the Disputed Messiahs book also is in English now.
It also appeared in
yeah.
Okay.
And that's already out. That's already out, and the Red Jews book will be out. So I'll link to that. I'll link to all the stuff that you said, and as well as, if you can, I'll link to your articles, it's on your academia page, I believe, right?
Yeah,
I can link to it there. Okay, perfect. And if there's anything else that you come up, you can send it along. And hopefully this was interesting. And to the listeners.
Great, yeah. Good to see you again.
Likewise. Thank you for joining me once again.
Thank you very much.